Good afternoon. You're still here? That's wonderful. Nobody's gone back to the room to take a nap? Or was that earlier? I was asked earlier how to pronounce my last name. It's Easter, like what happened last weekend. And I'm very often confused with another person in Deaf Ed whose last name is Estabrooks. But the difference is that he's a dude and I'm not. And so it's Easter like the bunny, and I have to admit that every couple of years we get phone calls all weekend long from children. Is this the Easter bunny's house? Since it's been such a long day and everybody's tired, I thought I would start off with some presents. And Mark has mentioned to you that we have some articles available. I actually have a file on some travel drives with links that you can go directly to the article. These are high impact factor articles that have been in the Journal of Deaf Studies and Deaf Education. So let me start, I'm hiding. Let me start by asking if our grandfather is here. Is grandfather here? Hi, grandfather. Would you give that to him? These are. And who traveled here the farthest? Traveled the farthest? Not a presenter. I came farther than you, honey. Sorry. How far? 299 miles. You get one. How far, ma'am? In the back? 900 miles, you getting? Whoa, you definitely get one. All right. Who has been in the field working with deaf and hard of hearing students the longest? I've been doing it 42 years. That's a long enough time. Who's been doing it the longest? 1974. Anybody been doing it since longer than 74? All right. So who's been doing it since 1975 or 6 or 7? Got another one, got a couple back there. You might as well take all of these, Brooke. Who is a practitioner and has the most, a full-time practitioner and has the most children at home? Full-time practitioner with 5 kids. Give me 5. Okay. Anybody with 4? That's more than double duty. That's quadruple duty. You get it? Do you need any more, Brooke? I mean, any more people needing? Over there? 2 left. Okay. Let's see. Who drove here this morning, who didn't stay over, but drove here this morning, and it took you the longest amount of time? Anybody come here this morning from afar? Up here. And then our PhD student, who's our PhD fellow right over here? Oh, you have one already. Never, did I give you one? Our DOT student? Yes, he gets one. Okay, give yourself a hand, because if you've been in the field that long and you're working that hard, thank you, thank you, thank you. Appreciate it. This is an unusual setup in trying to see the screen here. In order to see it, I have to take my glasses off, which means I can't see you. So if you feel free to give me all these weird looks, because I won't see them anyway. And I am officially retired, yes, from my university position in teacher preparation, but I'm still working on the Foundations for Literacy and CLAD grant, half-time, and that means I work full-time for half-time pay. And I want to tell you, oops, wrong one. Wrong button. I want to tell you about our center. It's a Center on Literacy and Deafness. It's a national research and dissemination center funded by the Institute of Education Sciences And the exciting thing about it is that this is the largest single research grant that has ever been given to the field of deaf education that focuses specifically on literacy and specifically on kindergarten through second grade. So we're really excited to have this opportunity to be making some inroads into our knowledge base, specifically in early literacy. Here's the grant numbers. You always have to tell what your grant numbers are. And if you want to go and find out what's going on with our project, you can go to the CLAD website, Center on Literacy and Deafness, and it is clad.education.edu. I'm sorry, .gsu.edu. clad.education.gsu.edu. There it is up there. And then you should be able to follow what we're doing and our current studies, and there's tons of reports you can read. I'll refer to this website periodically because there are some resources on it that I'd like to suggest you might want to take a look at. This is a huge and exciting project. We have multiple collaborators from all over. University of Arizona, Dr. Shireen Antia is co-principal investigator. University of Colorado Boulder, Dr. Shook is one of our collaborators. And Arizona State University, Dr. Carol Connor is one of our collaborators. And we have some junior collaborators as well at the University of British Columbia, Dr. Cannon, and at the University of North Florida, Dr. Gardino. And then we have imposed on, I can't tell you how many people since this all started. CLAD's objectives are three categories: that to describe the development of language and literacy skills in a diverse sample of kindergarten through second grade children who are deaf and hard of hearing, to identify what instructional strategies work for which children, and to develop interventions for a range of issues that we all face in helping our students read. So let me start with objective one, because that's kind of behind us. We were charged with determining a model for reading and with describing the levels of functioning of students, and to kind of address the issue of, do deaf children read differently from hearing children? So part of this involved theory and statistics and those kinds of unfun things. I'm going to go through those really quickly and try to get on to the more interesting parts, but I think it helps to see what the base is for what we did. As with anything that you do, you have to start with your theoretical perspective. We all come to what we do with our own mindset. And in our field, we know that means that we all bring strong belief systems to it. And so are those beliefs child dependent, or are they beliefs that all deaf children are engaged in a particular manner? So their starting point was to develop a theoretical framework. That's what this little blank puzzle represents, is that we kind of came up with what the theoretical framework was that we were going to build this all around. And then after you speculate on your theory, you have to identify what are the ways that you're going to assess the individual pieces. And those are represented by the pieces in the middle. And then somebody told me I could do it this way, but I don't know if I'm that coordinated. Ta-da! Yes! Got it. And that's the last time I'll try it. So then after you gather your data, you see what it looks like. And you hope that when you put those data into that background, and put those little pieces together, that it confirms, yes, this is the picture as I thought it was. So that's really what the theoretical perspective on the data had us taking a look at. And so we, meaning the CLAD members from the multiple universities, meaning consultations with people in the field, with discussions, work groups, a long process, determined that we were going to start from the perspective of what's called the simple view of reading. And we know that now that the simple view, that terminology belies a very complex system. But the simple view tells us that there are essentially two huge components to reading. One is decoding and one is language. Well, I know you don't have to scratch the surface of what we do very far to find out that when we're talking about language, it is extremely complex. We're talking about decoding, it is extremely complex. But we speculated that for our kids in the decoding side, spoken phonology would be a critical factor, and finger spelling phonology would be a critical factor for the signing children. We also speculated in our model that American Sign Language would be a critical factor for children who use sign primarily, and that English would be a critical factor for children who use spoken or total communication or non-ASL. So after that, we then had to go through the process of determining what our measures were. Primarily, we adapted tests that are used with children with typical hearing, except for two tests, and they were the finger spelling phonological awareness test that was developed by Dr. Brenda Schick, and the ASL syntax test, also developed by Dr. Schick. On the next couple of pages here, I would encourage you, if you're interested in looking at the assessments that we did, to go to the CLAD website, and you can find a downloadable handout about all of the assessments we did. Let me just show you what we dragged all those poor little babies through. All those cognitive tests, all those auditory and speech tests, all the phonological ability tests, all the language tests, and more language tests, and then literacy tests, and more literacy tests, and then a spelling test at the end of it all. So we did about an hour and a half or 2 hours of assessment in the fall on all these kids, and then about an hour and a half or an hour in the spring. We assessed 354 children, kindergarten, first and second grade. So where do you think we found these children? Did we go to downtown Minneapolis to find 354 kindergarten, first and second graders? Do you know how many nationwide, about how many kindergarten age deaf and hard of hearing children there are across the whole country? About 3,000. There's about 3,000 children at any particular age range nationwide. And we have, 20,000 different school systems in the country. So they're scattered all over everywhere. So in order to get the assessments on that many children, we went from Vancouver, British Columbia, all the way to St. Petersburg, Florida. St. Augustine, I do that all the time. St. Augustine, Florida, because we are a low incidence disability. So to get that many students into the pool, it was a 2-year process, And we had to go to over 100 different pull-out classrooms. We went to pull-out classes only based on the assumption that if the child was in the general ed curriculum and making it fine in gen ed without the need of any support services, then that child didn't need any of the special interventions that we were proposing to create. And so the kids that we were able to assess came from pull-out programs. Ultimately, we had to throw out about 20 of the members of the sample for various reasons. Somehow, a hearing child got into the pool. Go figure. We did not include children who had significant cognitive deficits. We needed to find out what children without significant cognitive deficits and significant vision involvement, what they were doing before we could then take this as a baseline and see how those other populations were differing. So we did have a couple children who get into the pool who were vision impaired only. Don't ask me how. These kids were referred by their teachers, but you know, those things happen when you're doing research. It's the fun part. So we had 334 kids, kindergarten through second grade. They had from mild to profound hearing losses. They came from 9 different states and 1 Canadian province, and mostly they were in self-contained or resource. We administered this battery of tests in the fall and the battery of tests in the spring. And in addition, we went into their classrooms 3 times over the year, fall, winter, and spring, and we videotaped their language and literacy blocks. And then in the winter taping, I know tape, that's old-fashioned, recording. In the winter recording, we videotaped their entire year. So we have about 3,000 video hours of what's going on in classrooms with kids. This is just so exciting to me. And one of the things that we have been talking to recently with people in doc programs, that eventually when they are out and in their universities and we hope to make these tapes accessible, these videos accessible for the next level of researchers to look at them in greater detail than where we're going to be able to go by the end of the grant. So here's what they look like. Remember, this is not representative of the population. This is representative of children who don't have additional significant cognitive or visual issues, and of children who are in pull-out programs and not just doing fine in the mainstream. And so you can see, of the 334, 131 of our kids were sign only, voice off for the most part. 102 used spoken language and sign, and that is any variety from sign-assisted speech to speech-assisted sign. We had specific criteria for how we labeled these children. They had to have a teacher recommendation of their modality. They had to have specific scores on the early speech perception test, and then they had to have an interview with the examiner, and based on the examiner's check boxes on the interview list, combining all those 3, we place the kids into these categories. Okay. So I don't know, I'm sorry, those of you in the back, I'll try to do this really fast, but 45% of the sample was identified after 6 months of age. So here, after all these years, we have early identification. This is similar to what's going on in my state. About 60% of the kids, they're identified in the hospital, and then nobody picks them up. They just kind of get lost to follow up. And so this is, we thought we were really bad people in Georgia, but we found, whew, we're not so far off from the rest of the country. 45% of them were not identified until after 6 months. 50% of the students who use some kind of spoken language, whether that was with sign or without, use cochlear implants. Of the children in the sign-only group, the voice-off, sign-only, 50% of those kids had deaf parents. So it's a very unique population to look at, those 131 kids. And so that in and of itself is a future study to look at the videos of those 151 kids, and I hope that some doc student out there in the future might be interested in doing something along those lines. 51% of the sample received free or reduced lunch. We did not do any other socioeconomic strata assessments. 22% of them were labeled with mild disabilities, learning disabilities, attention disorder, minor behavior issues, that sort of thing. 41% were white, 30% Hispanic, 17% African American, and we had more kindergartners than first or second graders. By the time we got into second grade, so many of them were in the mainstream that we had fewer in the pull-out programs that we looked at, and 52% were little girls. So keep in mind that that's a different sample than the overall population. It's very targeted to students who are not successful in Gen Ed, and particularly we're really excited that we got such an even number across those modalities, the voice-off sign, spoken language, and some kind of sign, and spoken only. So we could make some comparisons across groups that we've been needing to make in the field. Okay, so now that we had all these data, we had to take a look at what did that mean relative to our theory. Remember the puzzle pieces? So we speculated on what those pieces would look like. We did the assessment, and we thought, here's the green piece, here's the yellow piece, here's the blue piece. And so now we had to fit them back into the model to see, did those data actually show us the picture we thought that it was going to show us? And so using confirmatory factor analysis and the M+ system and latent variable modeling, and you can ignore all of this stuff except this fellow over here who's going into a PhD program. He can't. Latent modeling, latent factor modeling is looking at things that you can't directly look at, like you can't measure wisdom. You can't directly look at that. It's a latent factor. But you can look at a person's wise decisions and see the outcomes of a wise decision. So that's where we were. We had to look at those latent, we were looking at those latent factors. And so language is something that you can't see going on inside a child's head. You can't see when he's languaging, but you can see what vocabulary he's using, what grammar he's using. So you get all those data and in the assessment, and then you see, does it give you that picture of how they're languaging? Does it give you that picture of how they're reading? And when you put those pieces into the puzzle, does it show you the picture that we thought it was going to show us? And here's the technical one, just so you see we did the hard math. Somebody else did the hard math. My guy who does the hard math, not I. And we found, in looking at the children who use spoken language and the children who use signing only, that, you know what, what they have to do is the same. They have to know language, but what language they know does not matter in this model. The kids who were higher users of a language, whether that language was ASL, specifically, I'm not talking about some kind of sign stuff, but whether that language was ASL or whether that language was English, the better languagers, the better the readers. And we also looked at, remember we were looking at the simple view of reading where you have the one piece is language and the other piece is the decoding side. Okay, so we looked at the language, and sure enough, kids have to have language in order to read. But as long as they have a language, that's the important thing. And then in terms of decoding, we did assessments of a phonological, an assigned version, a finger spelling version of phonological decoding, and typical spoken language version of phonological decoding. And as we suspected, the picture that we thought was going to turn up did, that both groups, whether they used sign or not, needed to decode, but so what they had to do was the same, but how they did it was different. And so the better phonological decoders they were, using the Schick phonological test, the better readers they were. The better spoken language decoders they were, the better readers they were. This is what it looks like in one of those models that goes into a heavy-duty research paper. But nobody cares about theory. You want to know what the children did. So here's what they did with language. In terms of expressive language, now, those of you who are psychologists and most of you know what means are, median, mode, standard deviation, and you know that if a child is at 100 on the bell curve when they're in 3rd grade, you expect them to be 100 on the bell curve in 4th grade because average is average is average is average, and growth over time is incorporated into those data. So to see any kind of movement of a standard score in a child's ability, to see that needle move at all is just really exciting, something very exciting. And so in our expressive vocabulary assessment, we found that children did grow over the course of the year, that it benefited our kids to be in school. In terms of the elaborated phrases, they grew a lot over the year, but you can see if this line that's 100 is typical average, you can see that our kids were starting off at a full standard deviation below the mean. And so this line would be the expected typical average line, and our students were starting off at a standard deviation below or more at the beginning of the year. But we did see that they grew over the course of the year. This was without any intervention at all. This was just pre and post. In terms of ASL, the ASL syntax test, here's what the kids did fall to spring, kindergarten, 1st and 2nd. Now this is not the same children. This is not longitudinal. This is of the kindergartners that we looked at, of the 1st graders, of the 2nd graders. So the kids who are in kindergarten are not the same as the ones who are in 2nd grade. We did this in a 1-year span. But you can see that their ASL syntax, when they were in programs where they learned ASL or used ASL, from starting kindergarten to the end of 2nd grade, improved. Now this is a raw score improvement, so what this means is something we're still working on. But our kids are improving, they are gaining. Here's where I may have to put my glasses back on, or I can just walk over here. That's what I'll do. This is and then I'll come back and I hope you all can see it over there. This is a thing that was very interesting to me in the passage comprehension, letter word identification and passage comprehension. In kindergarten, students were starting somewhere close to that 100, magic 100 average level. So they weren't doing all that poorly. And that was, time 1 was fall, time 2 was spring. And then time 1, time 2 for the first graders, time 1, time 2 for the second graders. Okay? So when they started off, and when we were measuring the kindergartners, they started off pretty close to that magic 100 mean that we use when we're placing kids. But you can see that by the time they hit second grade, they had dropped down quite a bit in standard scores, and even more so when we were looking at passage comprehension. This is their word knowledge, this is their passage comprehension knowledge down below. So what we saw was that, and then in talking with a lot of the teachers, kids are being assessed in kindergarten in those IEP meetings, and they're being placed based on that, and services offered to them based on this notion that they're not doing too far, they're not so far away from hearing kids. And then we're speculating, maybe not getting the intensity of services that they need based on that initial perception that their language wasn't that far off. But by the time they got to second grade, I mean, this, 78, that's really quite a drop down, and indicates that the student is really struggling. So we're speculating, and one of the things that we're going to see when we look at all these videos, we're speculating that kids are testing okay at first and getting a false impression of what they can and can't do, and assumptions are being made about what they need early on that are not true, not holding up, that they are needing more and more and more services rather than fewer and fewer and fewer. And as I go around the nation visiting these schools and seeing what's happening, I see kids, the intensity of services that kids are getting waning. I don't know if that's happening in your state, but it is certainly happening in a lot of the states. Rather than, maybe we need that intensity. We were talking about that, I think it was in Dr. Marshark's fireside chat, where he was talking about, fourth grade seems to be, there's a real shift in learning to read versus reading to learn. Maybe we need to keep working on learning to read more intensely for a longer time with our kids, rather than just saying, oh, they're doing okay, this is what they're doing in kindergarten, they'll be fine. We see that they're not. Here's just another way of looking at the passage comprehension. You can just see that in the kindergarteners, that from kindergarten to second grade, their skills just went from near expected down into the toilet, from near what you would want to down to critically low. All right, and then you can see what has gone on with the second graders. You find the same deterioration of skills. In terms of spoken language blending, C-top, oral blending sounds together to make words. The kids with spoken language they started off just a little bit above 1 standard deviation. If they use spoken language, if they use speech and sign, any kind of sign, then their blending skills those children's blending skills were not as strong as the children who use spoken language only. So that says they're not getting the same kind of instruction and opportunities to learn to blend. And in finger spelling blending, using Dr. Schick's test, we found that the students from fall to spring, fall to spring, fall to spring in kindergarten, first and second grade were able to increase their blending ability through finger spelling. So this kind of gave us the notion that maybe finger spelling would be an alternative route to decoding for our signing kids. So that brought me back to a study that I had done a long time ago, well, 2005, that's not all that long, but anyway, a while back, where I asked master teachers in the field of deaf education. This is, I guess, right around 2003 or 4 that I was gathering the data. I asked them, do you teach phonological awareness and phonics? And most of them told me, no, they do not. You can't teach that to children who have a hearing loss. And I think if some of you have been at this for a while, think back to what you were doing 10, 15 years ago. Were you doing phonological awareness? They said no, that it was not of benefit, that it was too costly, too time intensive, and then some of them fessed up to the real issue, which is they didn't know how to do it. So since then, there's been a huge push to engage in phonological awareness with our kids with hearing loss, and we're seeing gains. So what's going on with the signing kids? That's kind of brought us to where we are in the first round of analysis of what it is we're doing. So we know from our study that language is delayed at the start of school, especially syntax. Our kids, although they're delayed in vocabulary, they still keep making vocabulary process. Who's the young lady I was talking to about this in the hallway earlier? Over there. Hi, how are you? That we focus on vocabulary. Now it's tier 1 and tier 2 and tier 3 vocabulary, and we pre-teach the vocabulary, and we reteach the vocabulary, and we post-teach the vocabulary, and our kids still aren't making grammar gains. And so if we want them to be reading and comprehending text, they need to have that underlying grammar. And our data show that there's a huge imbalance between the vocabulary that they're mastering and the grammar. Our children are not making language, do make language gains across the years, but very slowly. They start at grade level in reading, but then there's a sharp decline, and then phonological awareness is weak, and bimodal children resemble signing children when it comes to the use of finger spelling for reading, which brings us to the conclusion that structures of early literacy are the same. Kids have to learn the same thing. How they learn that is what's different. And so I'm going to skip over this and to go into our next objective, which now is to identify child by instruction interactions. And that involves coding of all the videos we have. So we have a process for coding all of the videos, the thousands and thousands of hours, and we're getting very close to that first pass. Here's one of my master's students who's also my graduate research assistant, Melissa, sitting in front of that computer looking at probably the 500th hour of videos that she's had to look at in this process. And so we use a system where you punch a code in, and then you watch a string, and then when that action stops, you punch it again, then you click a code, and it tells you what went on during that particular string of time. So here are the things that we're looking at in the first pass at coding. We're looking at what kind of instruction is going on. We are coding the videos for what kind of group the kids are in. We're coding it for management style. We're coding it for literacy content. And then we're coding it for non-instructional activities. I think I have a second. No, let me go back. Sorry. So we've done the first pass, and now we're in the middle of looking at the second pass, which is that we have gone back and looked at the videos for literacy, and we're in the process, this is where we are right now, we're in the process of recoding these for all of these features: phonological awareness, sign phonology, English morphology, word decoding, word encoding, all of the things that go into those code-based or decoding and the meaning-based. So this, to me, I can't wait till we're done this part, because I want to see how much time teachers are spending on these different sorts of things. Theoretically, hypothetically, what we will then be able to do is look at things like amount of time or dosage spent on a particular literacy skill relative to the child's gain over the course of the year. So that's really where we're heading with it, and we're right in the middle of doing all that coding right now. It's a lot of video to go through, and you can only torture a poor, unsuspecting graduate student for so long before it's time to find another one to torture. Okay. So we have confirmed through our data, though, something that Vicki Dunn and Naomi Zygmunt found in 2008. They took a look at 3 school systems, all the deaf and hard of hearing kids in 3 school systems, and they found that during the entire instructional block for literacy, children actually spent only 12 minutes a day reading. So we're doing tons and tons and tons of things in the name of teaching reading, but they're not spending very much time actually doing it. And so just a visual analysis, I don't mean from the perspective of single case design, I mean from the perspective of the graduate assistant's been sitting there for 50 hours watching this and going, these kids never read for 3 whole weeks. And so from experiential analysis, we're finding that our kids are not spending very much of that reading instructional time actually reading. So we're trying to figure out what that means. What are they doing? And then all this coding is going to allow us to look at that. What are they actually doing instead? And then we found out that from the videos and just gut level reaction to this, we kind of confirmed Dr. Marshark's work with this crew here, that students are less aware than their hearing peers when they don't understand something that they read, that they rely more heavily on pictures in the books than on their actual background knowledge, and that they tended to be very passive readers. And I'll talk to you about another study we did where we confirmed that. But then the next thing is that we've gone into this kind of second pass of coding, where we're taking a look in greater detail. So one of the things that we did was that my students in the deaf and hard of hearing program and I took the children's fluency passages. We had them read 3 different passages for fluency, and rated their fluency based on rate, time, you know. So in the data collection, either they passed it and moved on, or they didn't. We took that chunk of kids who passed it and went on and looked at the videos and recoded the videos for rate, correct words per minute, and we also looked at miscues and self-corrections, and then a comprehension question. We had, in that group, we had, I think, 107 students that we looked at. And what we found was that, yeah, they were slower in rate. They were slower in correct words per minute. But the thing that was most striking was their miscue analysis and self-correction profiles. Usually when you do a miscue, and lots of you do miscue analyses, right? So you get this variety of things that kids do. They try to self-correct, or they correct it wrong, or they ask you to tell you what it is, or they say it and then they say it again. I mean, there's all these different strategies they used. What we found is that the students, the deaf and hard of hearing students who read the fluency passages and then on whom we did the miscue analysis, either knew it or they didn't. They either answered it correctly or they hopped over it. They ignored it and they moved on. That was very striking to us as we looked at the data. Either they knew the word and they read it, or they hopped over it. Very few strategies. So they've learned, if you don't know it, just go to the next word. And I guess they've learned that somebody will tell it to you and then you just go on. So that's a very productive line of that I'm looking at right now in trying to see of the kids who did attempt to correct themselves if they made a mistake, what did they do? And so I'm right in the middle of doing all that right now, so maybe next year I can tell you what they did. But the sad part is that they had no strategies. So that's one thing and that I hope you will take away from this, that if you're working on expressive reading with your students and you're doing any kind of assessment or any kind of guided reading, be sure that you are teaching them strategies to utilize. If they don't know what to do when they come across a word that they don't know how to read, then what are they supposed to do? So they didn't even try to decode. They didn't try to fake it. They didn't try to invent a word. You know, a lot of kids will see a letter and then they'll invent a word that begins with that same letter. They didn't do that at all. So very, very few strategies. And that to me is very telling as to why our kids are struggling. They don't have the strategies for addressing a word when they don't know it. So in the videos now, we're going to be able to start teasing out for the kids, who are the kids who did develop the strategies and who are the ones who did not. And for the students who did do specific strategies for figuring out words, what did they do? And so this whole area of the coding and the child by instruction interactions is an area we're just now diving into, and we hope to be able, when the final coding of the videos are complete, to make this body of data available to other researchers who want to come and say, you know, I would really like to look at all your videos of the first graders non-instructional time. What are they doing? What's non-instructional mean? And how are they fooling around in the classroom so that we can give them strategies to get them back on task? So as one example. So we encourage you, future researchers, to keep in touch with what we're doing, because we've got some great data for you. The third and most exciting part of what we're doing, to me, is the development of a set of interventions that are developed specifically for deaf and hard of hearing struggling readers in kindergarten through second grade. There are several that we're working on right now. Theory of mind. I know we were talking earlier in Dr. Marshark's fireside chat about personality and how that gets in, and executive function. You know, executive function sounds so important for our older kids, but what does it look like in our younger kids? I think it looks like theory of mind. With Dr. Schick and a subgroup of people in the CLAD grant are looking at an intervention called Finger Spelling Our Way. Finger Spelling Our Way to Reading, sorry. And this is a finger spelling based phonological coding and decoding intervention that they've been developing for several years. Also, Foundations for Literacy, which is a pre-kindergarten or emergent literacy intervention that we've been working on forever and are about to roll it out into a randomized controlled trial across the country if we find people willing to participate. Dr. Shireen Antia has developed an intervention called Vocabulary for Success, and has some data on that that's not going into the national trial. The second and third are the Finger Spelling Our Way intervention and Foundations for Literacy. We're actively seeking research participants to begin in the fall to implement these interventions. We have to have 40 pre-kindergarten through second grade classrooms. Pull-out classes, which means we'll be going all around the country to try to find these groups. This is a condition of our granting agency that we do it that aggressively and intensively. So we may be coming back to the Minneapolis-St. Paul area to work with some of your pre-kindergarten, kindergarten, first grade children. Very exciting. And then we're in the process of developing a syntax intervention. If you want to read more information about these interventions, if you would go to our website and then go to Reports and Publications, this right over there, Reports and Publications, and then click on Research and Presentations. So you would go to the main website, then Reports and Publications, then Research and Presentations. This is a list of all of the articles that have been written from data from the project, and all of the presentations that have been done based on data from the project. I would encourage you to scour through that and keep in mind that more and more and more information will be added to that pool. Let me tell you about one of the interventions that we developed, and this is the Theory of Mind intervention. We were talking, a group was talking about what it is, even the college-age kids, that they don't know that they don't know something. They think they know more. They think they've learned more than they have, even if they have a good teacher, even if they have a good interpreter. They think they know more than they know, but they don't know that they don't know. And so what does that look like early on with little kids? And it relates to the concept of theory of mind. Theory of mind is that you understand that the person sitting next to you might be thinking something differently from what you're thinking. The clearest example I can give of this is that I was at a restaurant, and a little 2-year-old boy was there with his parents. Dad stood up to go to the bathroom. The little boy stood up on the edge of the seat and flew out like that and landed smack on the floor and got up screaming, "You didn't catch me! You didn't catch me!" And the father spun around frantic and said, "I didn't know you were going to jump." He said, "Yes, you did. I always jump. You always catch me. But you didn't tell me you were going to jump. But I always jump. You always catch me." And they went back and forth and back and forth. And that is because this little boy did not have a theory of mind. He didn't know that his dad didn't know what was in his head. That's what a theory of mind is, knowing what is in another person's head. And that relates with older kids to the issue of knowing what you know and knowing that you might not know, and knowing what you know might be different from what the other person knows. So we created this intervention. Dr. Stacy Tucci, one of my recent doc students, really proud of her, created this intervention for theory of mind. And we've been able to move the needle on that. She looked at stages of theory of mind, and there's a stage where a child looks at something and knows it, and then a stage where they're not looking at it, but they still know it, but they don't realize that they've retained an image in their heads. This is based on work by Wellman and Peterson, where they did thought bubble interventions. So then they go to the level where they're thinking of it. Then they go to a level where they don't see it, but they're still thinking about it. So you see it and you think about it. And then you're looking at it. Then you're looking at it and you're thinking about it. Then you're not looking at it, but you're still thinking about it. That's another level. And then it gets harder. Somebody comes along and changes what it is that you looked at. And so there's this false belief task that everyone does in the area of theory of mind, where one child thinks they know what is in the basket or in a box, and then they have to turn. Another child comes in, changes it out, and they have to determine, is it still the same thing or is it different? And then it gets harder, more and more and more complex. Well, Dr. Tucci created the materials for this intervention, and she did the intervention using single case design with 2 classes of children, signers and non-signers, and found that children were able to master the concept of theory of mind. And so if you want more information about this intervention, she would really like to talk with people who'd be interested in trying it out and helping her flesh it out into a better product. But here's her email. She gave me permission to give it to you. So that's one of the interventions that came out of what we were doing. And then the next is this finger spelling our way to reading, because we're pretty sure from the data that we've gathered that phonological coding can be utilized as an alternative to decoding in general for kids who sign. We know that the spoken phonological code represents words, that we code it through the alphabetical principle, and that there is a relationship to English orthography. But in American, the ASL phonological code through finger spelling, ASL phonological code, as typically defined, is related through signs and does not relate directly to English orthography. But we speculated that finger spelling could be utilized in a one-to-one relationship with print orthography. And so Dr. Schick, Dr. Letterberg, and people from both teams have developed this intervention. It's a full-year intervention called Finger Spelling Our Way to Reading. And you can go to this website address, ed-moodle.gsu.edu/fingerspelling, and you can download this brochure about it. I think she's going to be at the School for the Deaf in Minneapolis, and I think she's going to be gathering information at the Metro. I don't know if she's heard back yet from the Metro Day School, is it? From Metro Deaf School. Sorry. So she's hoping to get in there, but hasn't heard back yet. But if you know of any other locations where there are signing kids who are voice-off signers who might be interested in being involved in this randomized controlled trial, we're rolling it out in the fall in 20 control classes and 20 intervention classes nationwide, and so they're in the process of actively recruiting participants for this intervention to see if this moves the needle on reading decoding for our young deaf kids who are finger spellers. Dr. Antia in Arizona has developed a process called Vocabulary for Success. It's not as far along as the other two interventions. She has single case data on it and is doing some additional studies and additional design work on the intervention, and then in future years that may roll out as a randomized controlled trial. But she's found these 4 procedures, 4 strategies as being critical in vocabulary acquisition: fast mapping, interactive book reading, conversation, and then extension activities. Fast mapping is a process that all children use to learn vocabulary, to learn new vocabulary. We see a word, we see 2 objects, and the child might know cup, and the child might know clock, and then, but not necessarily microphone, and you point to that and you say, here are the 3 objects in front of the child. Give me the microphone, and because the child knows the other 2, he automatically applies that word he doesn't know to the object and the vocabulary of the item he doesn't know. That's called fast mapping. So she designed an intervention that created the tasks and the materials and all the little flip cards and all the little balls and cups and things that you give to the children, and found that deaf kids, in fact, are very good at learning vocabulary through fast mapping. So that was followed up by the next, push the button here, incorporating that into interactive book reading, incorporating that into conversation, and then following up with some drills and practices and work on concepts. So if you're interested in that and you want to contact Dr. Antia, she would love to hear from you, and she will keep you posted, or you can look on the CLAD website and see where our research is going in that area. I'm just going to skip over this. And then the other one that we're doing a randomized controlled trial on, national controlled trial on, is Foundations for Literacy, which is an emergent literacy curriculum. This is 1 hour a day, 4 days a week, with follow-up activities on the 5th day if the teacher so desires. And it starts off with a story that embeds a sound, a phonological concept into a story. Students learn the story, then they engage in a plan, do, and recall activity geared to help the child make that connection between the sound and the concept represented in the activity. So for example, the sound O is this little girl is being chased around. This is Kate, and she's being chased around by a bee, and she's going, oh, 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 as the bee's chasing her. So there's a story of the Miss Giggle characters, who are the primary characters in the intervention, and the kids pretend that they're chasing each other with bees, or that they're, Gardening with Miss Giggle, and they learn all the vocabulary through the Miss Giggle story. They make the connection with the sound letter correspondence, and then there are other activities that are involved in the intervention. So we're rolling that out in the fall. We're looking specifically in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area for kindergarten, pre-kindergarten classrooms. So if you have a pre-K classroom, pull out each class has to have a minimum of 3 students in it because of attrition. If one child gets sick or moves or leaves, you can't have a classroom of 1 child. So based on the research design as it was set up. We would love to talk to you if you're interested. Dr. Antia is working on a syntax intervention, but that's still in the early developmental stages. We've got to get some of this stuff assessed and out there and used in the field. So we have stuff coming up through the ranks, stuff that's in the design stage, stuff that's in the think about it in your brain stage, and stuff that's in the randomized controlled trial stage that we hope to get out there as soon as possible. And so if you're interested in participating in the randomized controlled trial, we would love to hear from you. I think I have 8 minutes left, and in that 8 minutes, I just want to tell you some of the other things that we're looking at. We did not, we're not funded to do any assessments of noise in the classroom, but hey, since we were out there, we gathered data on noise in empty classes and in classes where the children were present. Pardon me. And we have data on noise in 100 classrooms, and we looked at that data relative to ANSI standards, which are the standards for noise in classrooms. And we found that most of the classrooms our kids are in are very noisy, far too noisy for them to get maximum benefit out of their listening technology. So oddly enough, the kids we did have several kids in the study who received their instruction in a push-in environment, and we did go and include some children in push-in environments. And oddly enough, the classrooms for the hearing kids were quieter than the classes for the deaf kids, without kids in them, and with kids in them. So why might that be? Well, think about it. Where do our classes get placed? They get placed in a closet, a big closet with poor acoustics. They get placed at the podium in the back of the cafeteria with they draw the curtain thinking that's going to be the great acoustic environment you need, and it's really not. So that's one of the things that Dr. Michelle Gremp, who is at Eastern Kentucky University, and I are writing up. We hope to have that out in the literature pretty soon. But if what we've been told by all the auditory verbal therapists and by all of the acoustics, acoustic physiology people for years and years and years, we've been told that noise matters. And we know that noise matters for hearing kids. Then why are we putting our kids in really noisy environments and expecting them to be able to sort through that? I mean, it's like they're in extra noisy environments for some reason. I'm doing an analysis of function words. We gathered language samples from the pre-kindergarten kids using Frog, Where Are You? And we found that our students are gaining in content vocabulary in their language, but they are not gaining in function vocabulary in their language. Function vocabulary is that really hard stuff to learn. we think, oh, well, we've got to have all these pictures, and we've got to act out the vocabulary, we've got to use it in context, and we've got to make the vocabulary rich, 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 rich. And then, but how do you do that for the word of? Well, I don't know, that's a really hard word. We'll just make them memorize it. And so the hardest words, the hardest vocabulary items are those function words. And so we then say, well, they're the hardest words kids have to learn, they'll just memorize them. That just doesn't fit. So one of the things that we know is that function words make sense within the context of phrases. And so we're looking at phrase-level language acquisition, phrase-level reading, and as that place where grammar and semantics overlay one another. So individual words, our kids are pretty good at. They're not making that leap to syntax, and without that leap to syntax, they're not mastering reading comprehension. So in terms of function words and phrase-level reading, that's where the function words are found within the context of phrases, and you can teach phrases in that imageability model where you provide the image. So if I say with a cane, walking with a cane, versus with my sister, those mean two entirely different things, but you can get a picture in your head of what those mean. And so we're just now starting to look at the relationship of function words to grammar. That's kind of like, in the middle between individual words and grammar, that we're missing something, we're not doing something. And I think it's that phrase level stuff that we're not doing. So here are some other things that we're doing. I'm told that I just have a few more minutes. Let me see if there's any other one I want to point out here. Oh yes, the team out in Arizona is developing a classroom observation scale, an environment rating scale, based on starting from the coding that we're using. In the coding process of the videos, they're taking that and turning it into an environmental rating scale, and they'll be able to take that environmental rating scale and look at it relative to all the data that we have on the students and come up with an evidence-based scale that you will be able to use to go into a classroom and say, this is a really good learning environment for deaf and hard of hearing kids. This is not a good learning environment for deaf and hard of hearing kids. So those are just some of the highlights of what we're doing. And I thank you for indulging me and sitting there so patiently. And I'm making a shameless plug here for my literacy instruction book through Oxford University Press. And thank you for your time.